It is not only us who are predicting the collapse of the US. Let's take a look at what's going on with US inflation statistics. Some will start writing in the comments that our Rostat is lying. Author, have you seen the prices in our stores? That's a phrase I've seen more than once in the comments. Before we start looking at what's happening with US statistics, let's answer that question right away. We can see the prices in the stores just fine and see what happens to them. For some things they grow noticeably, for some things they don't change. For something going up and down. For example, on sunflower oil, granulated sugar and the same chicken eggs. But so far I haven't seen any hard evidence anywhere that Rostat gives incorrect information on the overall percentage of inflation. And I have only seen loud shouts, like, "You're all lying," of those who show a high percentage of price increases for certain products. If there is someone who wants to spend time and prove to everyone that Rostat deceives us and understates the figures, then he needs to prove it, photograph the prices for the whole range of products, goods, medicines and services, which are used by Rostat for calculation, in several large retail chains, in several regions, then a year later do exactly the same thing, add up all the prices to get two sums for both years, and then calculate the percentage of inflation. Then and only then he will be able to become famous in the networks and will be able to claim with evidence in his hands that Rostat is deceiving us. And I have, unlike various disgruntled whiners and denouncers of authority. There's proof that Rostat doesn't lie. Now let's move on to the United States. Since the end of last year, you and I have seen an extremely positive picture for the US. In May 2022, the Fed began raising its key rate to beat long unseen US inflation, which reached a high of 9.1% in June 2022. And it really worked. Inflation in the US began to decline rapidly, although it again showed a small rebound from 3.1% to 3.4% in December. According to official data, inflation was 7.04% in 2021, 6.45% in 2022 and appears to be around 3.4% in 2023. So, prices should have cumulatively increased by 17.82% over 3 years. The sequel follows, if the inflation rate really corresponded to the officially announced figures. Now let's look at what's really going on with official US statistics. And taking a closer look is Tucker Carlson and his guests, renowned economist Stephanie Pomboy, founder and president of the research firm Macro Mavins. So, Tucker says, if you go outside of the rich people's world where everything is fine, you'll immediately notice that people are worried about the economy. Not only macroeconomics, the impact of monetary policy on the world, but also for their personal well-being. Americans are running out of money. Not the homeless, the middle class, even the well-to-do are running out of money. And then Christmas came. This is a huge problem because everything has gotten more expensive. You may have noticed that a typical grocery bag from the movie Home Alone will now cost you $72.28. As recently as last year, it cost $44.40. On a personal note, I would like to add, recall that over the past year, the official inflation rate is approximately 3.4%, but in reality it turns out that the growth of prices is not for 3, but for a year by 62%. Well, if Tucker's not lying to us, let's keep going, from 44 to 72 in a year. But it's actually worse than that. Since Joe Biden took office, prices on just about everything have skyrocketed. Bacon is up 24%, eggs are up 41%, alcohol is up 11%, airfare is up 42%, heating oil is up 20% and prices continue to rise. Here you see 17.8% somewhere, but I see alcohol at only 11%. And as prices have risen, credit card rates have also risen from 16% to 23%. We would add from ourselves that credit card interest rates have equaled ours. For example, the interest on the Sberbank credit card is 23.9% per annum. But let's move on. There is no denying that the country has become poorer and deeper in debt. How bad is it and what happens next? It feels like we are being lied to and everything is much more expensive. Is that true? Stephanie replies, yes, it is. This is the absolute truth, contrary to what people on Wall Street and in the president's administration tell us. Wall Street, administration, Federal Reserve report huge victory as reported inflation numbers slowed from 9% to 3%. But as you pointed out, prices for everything have risen dramatically for Americans, and now they're rising at a slightly less staggering rate. We would add from ourselves, that 9% for them was overwhelming. And what would they sing if they had inflation like Argentina 160% or Turkey 65%, but they actually do. Because with a national debt of $34 trillion, such inflation is deadly for them, because it will lead to multiple increases in debt service, interest payments, and bankrupting the banks that hold fixed interest US government debt. But let's move on. That is, everything is exorbitantly expensive, but it's getting more and more expensive at a slower and slower pace. And for them, it's a cause for celebration. I would like to point out that these figures are themselves quite misleading. They are cited by the government, which tends to underestimate inflation. The fact is that all cost of living adjustments, things like Social Security and our tax payments, are tied to that particular figure. So they should underestimate that number as much as possible. We would like to add that we do not have this, so there is no point in underestimating Rostat. Let's keep going. In the real world, inflation has never stopped at 9%. In the real world it has probably reached 20%, and who knows what it's like now. End of direct speech. Note that they may not be seeing the whole set of goods either, but knowing that the US authorities are very fond of changing the methodology of calculating their GDP to inflate it as much as possible, we can also assume that they are tweaking something in the inflation calculation to deflate it as much as possible, for both are vital to them. Stephanie goes on to report that income growth has not kept pace with rising prices. Disposable income is decreasing, and points out that under Biden, real after-tax income adjusted for the government's measure of inflation, which is not even real inflation, fell by $800 billion, while under Trump it rose by $4,300 billion. So people are using credit card money at an increased 23% just to avoid living a worse life. Those interest payments have doubled since Biden took office. During the pandemic, when people were mailed checks, that is, given helicopter-printed money, many people prudently paid off their credit card debts. And now the debts have started to rise sharply again and are back to what they were after the global financial crisis. But now they will be much higher, because income growth has not kept up with inflation, which means credit card debt will only increase, especially as interest rates have risen. Tucker had an interesting question. If a huge percentage of the population stops paying credit card debt, what can they, the banks, do? Stephanie responds that they will have an answer to it very soon because delinquency rates are rising and that will likely be reflected in the financial markets as losses increase. Banks are not in very good shape right now because they are taking huge losses on their securities. We will add from us, they invested in government debt, but due to high inflation and low interest rates on these securities suffered serious losses, which is what happened to Silicon Valley Bank. Let's keep going. And once the losses on loans, credit cards, commercial real estate and everything else start to mount, they will have real problems that will lead to a crisis that will be paid for by the middle class. In 2024, she predicts an unpleasant situation where many companies will close down because they can't handle servicing their debt and will lay off a lot of people as a result, making the situation for ordinary people even more difficult. Stephanie believes that the US will have to pay a heavy price for pursuing the most reckless monetary and fiscal policies in the world. Tucker noted that they built the entire economy on debt, but now you can see it was insane. Now we want to give Stephanie's direct speech again, so that the whiners and skeptics in the comments don't say that it's us couch pundits predicting the collapse of the US, and also to show you what overly cheap credit ultimately does to the economy and people. So, it really started in the early 80s. We had a peak in interest rates at first, and when they started to come down, debt became more and more attractive. Here's a hello to the proponents of cheap credit. Let's keep going, because you could borrow it at lower and lower interest rates. And then it became an engine of growth for the economy. We stopped being the people who make the real things and outsourced the manufacturing, the hard labor to countries like China, Indonesia, India, and so on. And we got into paper production, just printing dollars. Which I think is a much more elegant endeavor. We allow the rest of the world to manufacture all of our stuff as well as pharmaceuticals. While we're making paper. We imagined we could grow forever on all this debt we're printing. Since the rest of the world is so enamored with our dollars that they will continue to pelt us with money. No matter how egregious our spending is, they will continue to support us by lending us money and taking our dollars in return. But things are changing and changing fast. Yet here US politicians continue to imagine that the dollar, as the world's reserve currency, will never have any competitors and that we can continue to mindlessly print money indefinitely. And everyone will just absorb them. But they don't do that anymore. They are no longer buying our treasury bonds and are actually moving their assets into gold, oil and strategic resources. And they start trading in the local currency so they don't have to make trades in dollars. I think the end of US hegemony is indeed near. The Biden administration and many in Washington are simply asleep, ignoring reality. And it's incredibly dangerous, both to our economy and to our national security. End of status. As they ponder the question of whether Wall Street realizes the plight of this situation, they conclude that it is too difficult for them to acknowledge the thought. So they continue to indulge in the fantasy that the dollar has no competitors. But they must see and realize that foreign central banks have stopped showing up regularly at their auctions of government debt securities. China is getting rid of these securities, and Russia got rid of it a long time ago. They realize this in Washington, but are prevented from admitting it by an insurmountable arrogance. There are many shifts in the economic and geopolitical landscape that are being ignored by their politicians, and no one is taking these threats seriously. I will supplement her words by reminding you that the BRICS grouping has been enlarged by 5 countries, as we talked about recently. Which means there will be another shift, not favorable to the US, toward liberation from the dollar's dominance. And the best part is that it confirmed my assumption that there will soon be no one to spurn the new US debt securities, and the Fed will just print money against these government debt securities and hoard them. Borrowing will degenerate into fiction. So they will just spit on the holders of their national debt and print dollars like crazy. And this would again lead to a significant increase in inflation, after which the dollar would quickly cease to be the world's reserve currency. Stephanie predicts this will happen in the next few years. Tucker summarizes that there will be a complete reset of their standard of living, for the worse of course. On that pessimistic note for the US and optimistic for us, we will end. The sequel follows.